Welcome everybody to Lecture 4, and today we have the privilege of reading and talking about John chapter 6, the bread of life. Jesus as bread of life. It's a chapter that's in many ways like a parallel to Jesus as living water, Jesus as bread of life. Anyone who eats this bread will live forever. The setting for this great discourse on Jesus as bread of life is the Passover. There's one wonderful biblical author, biblical studies that is, Aileen Gilding, and she's carefully studied the ancient synagogue lectionary for the readings around the feast of Passover. And Exodus chapter 16, which is all about the manna that falls from heaven to feed the Jewish people in the desert, Exodus chapter 16 features very strongly in the Passover readings, as does the book of Numbers chapter 11, and that speaks of the quails. So, Jewish people are listening to how God feeds his people in the desert as they celebrate the great feast of Passover. Another scholar, biblical scholar, Peter Borgen, has done a careful comparison between the Lord's discourse in chapter 6 on the bread of life and the structure of homilies that were given in synagogues around the same time. And he says that the discourse in John chapter 6 is really a remarkable homily with the same pattern as other homilies. So it's possible that at the heart of John chapter 6, especially the main discourse, verses 35 to 50, goes back to a homily preached by Jesus on a text selected from the lectionary for Passover time, and it was read in the synagogue at Capernaum, and Jesus spoke to that text. Of course, what Jesus is saying is that he is the food for life, and unlike the manna which our ancestors ate in the desert, this food will help us live forever. And of course, this chapter and Jesus' bread of life is just so central to us and our faith. Don't we sing on Sundays, Jesus, you are bread for us. Jesus, you are life for us. In your gift of Eucharist, we find love. And in the liturgy, we read the whole of the chapter 6 twice. Weeks 17 to 21 of year B, when we are looking at Mark's Gospel, there's a whole intervention. We stop reading Mark for 6 weeks and we look at this chapter 6 of St. John. It goes right into the reading of Mark. And the second time we read John chapter 6 is in Easter time, on Friday and Saturday of week 2, straight after Nicodemus, chapter 3, we go into chapter 6 for Friday and Saturday, and then the whole of the next week, week 3. So it's very clearly something the Church wants us to hear and listen to and take into our lives. How does St. John structure chapter 6? Well, 3 things. There are 3 parts really. The first is the miracle of the multiplication of the loaves and the fish. The second is Jesus walks on water, and the third is the great discourse itself. And then within that discourse we can see there's sort of like a preface, a setting of the scene, Then there's the Great Discourse, especially verses 35 to 50. Then there's the famous Eucharistic passage, which is, well, quite possibly a duplicate added here by the editor. And finally, the reactions from verses 60 to 71. So, first off, we're going to speak of the miracle, then we're going to speak of Jesus walking on water, and then we're going to speak of the discourse itself. So the miracle of the multiplication of loaves and fish. We are by the Sea of Galilee, that beautiful sea in Galilee. St. John calls it the Lake of Tiberias. John's writing later, by then the capital city of Herod Antipas has grown, and so it's natural that we start calling the lake after the main city. Some manuscripts suggest that this miracle is close to the city, which fits in with the Christian tradition from the 4th century, which says that the site where the multiplication of the loaves and fish took place is a place called Tabqa. Thanks, of course, we know this, to a fascinating female pilgrim from Bordeaux, whose name is Egeria, and she passed by in the early 380s AD. The present church at Tabqa is a reproduction of the mid-5th century edifice, with features which date from this church and a prior church, including the most beautiful mosaic in the country today, part of which is the celebrated mosaic of the 2 fish flanking a basket of loaves. So we have Jesus going up the mountain and sitting down. We're meant, of course, to think, going up the mountain, of Moses going up Mount Sinai, where he received the Torah to guide his people. As Jesus says, as John says in the prologue, the law indeed was given through Moses, but grace and truth have come through Jesus. We're also meant to think of the great messianic banquet, because the Messiah is here, he's going to feed us in a remarkable way. So we see Jesus, the Messiah, feeding his people. On this mountain, says Isaiah in chapter 35, the Lord of hosts will make for all peoples a feast of rich food. The mountain setting for the miracle almost tells us that Jesus is about to fulfill the hopes and expectations and longings of the Old Testament. Because the new Moses, the longed-for Messiah, is about to feed us with bread from heaven in a way that far out exceeds our hopes and our dreams. Now, the miracle of the multiplication of loaves and fish, we all know, is in all 4 Gospels. It would seem that John is using a very old account of the miracle, and it's an account which is quite independent of what's written in the Synoptic Gospels. John has some details which are peculiar to him. For example, he identifies Philip and Andrew. Interestingly, Philip and Andrew are very popular in Asia Minor, where we think the Gospel comes from. There's a lad with 5 barley loaves and dried fish. In 2 Kings, chapter 4, a man comes to Elisha with 20 barley loaves. Give to the people to eat, is what Elisha says. We can see some similarities in these 2 passages. The Eucharistic adaptations to the scene, which are given by St. John, are different